Yeah, one of the two seats. All right, everyone, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you to the people watching on the live stream. So we're really excited about this event. Plus, it's our first one since COVID, so we're really excited to kind of start back up, doing some more events, some more readings, and it should be really good. Let's see, so hopefully many more to come. So today, I think a lot of you probably already know Paul and Lynn, but Paul, for those who don't know, he's a writer, literary critic, and he's a professor at Lawrence Tech, as well as chair of the humanities department. So he's a published literary critic, but he's working on his first novel right now, so we'll be reading from that. And then Lynn, she's also an art critic as well as a fiction writer. Also published many volumes, and yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more that I'm missing. But if you guys want to get started.
Great. Thanks, Luke. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks to everyone for coming out. What Lynn and I decided to do is that I would read for about 30 minutes, and then she'll read for about 30 minutes. So yeah, this is like a really generous event for a lot of ways. So thanks to Luke for inviting us and for opening the space, and really to and also to Niobe for contributing to the marketing materials with her painting, which is great. And then Lynn, this has really happened because Lynn was generous enough to read my novel last winter, and then invited me to read with her. And we met because of Threefold, because we both were published in Threefold. So Threefold is like a co-sponsor, another reason that this whole thing happened. So I'm always grateful for these side of like literary and artistic communities as they sort of recover from the last few years. So I mean, every time I think about literature, I often wonder, like, does it really matter, you know? And then I remind myself that the people who are in power are afraid of it. And that's what keeps me kind of engaged. And so I kind of went off script a little bit and wanted to start with a cover, because this week we had a kind of dark example of the fear that literature can evoke among the powerful, with the College Board, you know, whitewashing the African American Studies curriculum, and after the governor of Florida tried to kick it out of the state. So I thought it would be appropriate to kind of start with a small poem by one of the authors who was erased from that curriculum, Audre Lorde, whose work means a lot to me, and really doesn't need, I think, much introduction. So I know we're on fiction, but I wanted to start with a poem. So this is a litany for survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. So, the novel that I've been working on for the last couple years is the story of this unnamed, ungendered character referred to only as X. And X has this visionary experience as a child, and the rest of the novel is kind of these episodes and adventures and escapades that X goes on, sort of like filling out and fulfilling that vision. So the section I'm going to read from today is from a later chapter in the book, when X is on this kind of like directionless road trip across the United States and stops in all of these bars along the way and has these conversations and hears these different stories. So it's kind of like linked short stories that fit together. So I thought that'd be good in this space. And the only like minor detail is that X is not really a drinker before they go on this particular part of the trip, but they have to start drinking because they go to bars. So they discover they like rum and cokes. So like every episode has a little rum and coke vignette. The title, I'm going to read the title is tentatively of that threatened beauty in which we are stranded. And the whole novel has an epigraph, which I will read from Edouard Glissant, the Martinican poet and author and philosopher. Glissant writes, "The landscape of your word is the world's landscape, but its frontier is open." The dive X visited in New Orleans was more like an oversized closet, a dark, skinny room with a single battered wooden bar running along the wall. The bar was decorated with yellowing pictures taken at various moments in the past. With very few exceptions, the photos were more or less composed in the same manner. 2 or 3 people standing with a drink in their hands, some next to the bar, some on the sidewalk, all with the glassy-eyed smile of someone happy and drunk. The differences in the image X could see primarily could be found in the colors and patterns of the clothes, the styles of the hair, all calling cards of past times. X recognized paisleys and velours, wide collars and tube tops, thick afros and elaborate bangs, spandex and shoulder pads, flannel shirts and seed caps, thick and wild or tight and faded. Every now and then, X could spot a face that looked familiar, the odd celebrity whose night or day had brought them to this pocket of the Big Easy. The bartender wore 2 wooden plugs in the lobes of his ears, glasses with thick black frames, and a woolen hat, even though, for X's taste, the weather was hot. The bartender liked to talk, and since the rest of the bar's patrons were congregated outside on the sidewalk, sitting on battered plastic chairs, X was the sole audience to the bartender's stories. He said his name was Andre, and that he had moved to New Orleans 15 years ago after winning a cocktail competition in Chicago. Had X ever been to Chicago? Not yet, X replied. Someday, I hope. Andre told X that he had been a barback at an upscale tiki joint frequented by young bonds traders who worked at the Chicago Stock Exchange and would come to the bar to drink elaborate punches involving flames and volcanoes of smoky dried ice served in the shells of fresh pineapples and coconuts. The head bartender called himself a famous mixologist who drank on the job, which meant that as the evening went on, the bartender became sloppy and imprecise, unable to manage the complex arrangements of ingredients that he himself had concocted during the earlier, more sober hours of the day. So even though Andre was paid only to cut lime wedges and clear empty glasses, each night the head bartender would ask Andre to shake, stir, muddle, crush, swizzle, float, infuse, smoke, and blend, so that he, Andre, soon became proficient not only with the tiki bar's deep menu of ornate Baroque drinks, but, and more importantly, had also developed a sensibility for the balance of proportion and form that transforms something into more than the sum of its parts. That magic, singular eruption of flavor that could so easily be destroyed by too much or not enough. But destroyed wasn't quite the word, since that suggested that a good drink somehow existed independently of the moment of its construction, which wasn't true, and was the reason that so many people went through life thinking that they knew what a drink tasted like, when, in fact, all they knew were the sorry failures that passed themselves off as the real thing, so that the true tragedy was that most people went through life believing they knew something that they had never actually experienced. Eventually, when the owners of the bar realized that it was actually Andre making the bonds traders spend their money on elaborate punches, they promoted him to head bartender and moved the drunk mixologist to the day shift, which so angered the mixologist that he promptly quit, although he didn't blame Andre for this sudden reversal of fortune, and in fact, he was secretly proud of Andre and considered him to be something of his protege. Soon after this promotion, though, Andre had entered the cocktail competition with an old-fashioned recipe that used a dark Jamaican rum. X had never heard of an old-fashioned, but smiled knowingly, not wanting to interrupt Andre's narrative arc. And it made it to the final round, held here in New Orleans, in which Andre won, and with the prize money in hand and flushed with victory, and having met so many famous people in the drinks and restaurant industry from New Orleans, and having spent all night after winning wandering from bar to bar in the thick, wet warmth of the city, where music was everywhere, even where you least expected it, Andre decided to stay, which meant that the tiki bar owners and their young bondsman clientele had no bartender, but fuck 'em. And the parties in New Orleans, Andre insisted to X as he made another rum and coke, are the best in the world. On New Year's Eve, for instance, Andre ended up at the rooftop party of this friend of his, a big-shot real estate developer who built hotels and clubs all over the city. And everything about this guy is big, physically tall and thick with a voice that you can hear from across any room. His parties were always big, too, and New Year's Eve was this developer's favorite holiday, so that the party was known all across the city, although the guest list was relatively selective due to the size of the rooftop, which was, every other day of the year, the outdoor pool and lounge for a luxury condo building in which the developer was the primary investor, and where he and his family lived, in the penthouse, so that the party could only include 100 or so of the developer's closest friends, a group in which Andre had not considered himself to be exactly a member, until, surprisingly, he received a personal text invitation. On that particular night, the pool was illuminated by a rich blue light that glowed through the steam coming off the water, since the pool was turned up to 85 degrees, so that, despite the cool winter weather, which, for someone from Chicago, was never actually cold, guests at the party could swim if they wanted to. And some of them did, too, the younger ones, while the rest of the party stood around the pool, under candles and torchlight, drinking sparkling wine, some of them straight from the bottle, and one of the most famous DJs in the city played this music that you could feel crawling over your skin and inside your muscles, so that even if you weren't actually dancing, and many people were, the music made you feel just as warm and happy. And all of the guests, Andre told X, were beautiful, or at least seemed to be beautiful in that flattering light, although many of them were genuinely beautiful in any light, the kinds of faces and bodies that could cut through a crowd of people simply with the power of their presence. But no one seemed to care that they were or weren't beautiful. Rather, no one used their beauty or the beauty of the other person to keep them from feeling happy and together, like an unspoken truce in the beauty war that waged every other day of the year, since, more than anything, everyone seemed to be united by the fact that they were watching the new year come into being on a concrete and steel platform lifted high above one of the most beautiful but also violent and impoverished cities in the United States. Andre found himself hanging with a group of musicians who were friends with the big shot developer and who had planned their tour so that they would arrive in New Orleans around the time of this party, playing the night before at one of the largest venues in the city. They lit a joint wrapped in clear cellulose, which made it appear that they were smoking weed right out of the air, passing the glowing coal among themselves, and Andre too, since everyone who was at the party wanted to be friends. The weed was thick and resiny, having come with them from California, where the band lived and recorded their albums in a giant ancient house planted at the top of a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Just as the weed took hold in Andre's muscles, making the sparkling wine taste that much more rare and potent, the fireworks and shotguns began exploding all over the city, marking the new year, and the band members began to kiss one another, so intently and passionately that it began to dawn on Andre that perhaps they were more than just a band or friends. But then they took turns kissing Andre too, and then Andre remembered feeling that in that moment, right there, was the living correlate to the drinks that he had dedicated his life mixing, that this feeling was an ingathering and balancing of experience and sensation that could only occur like a potion or spell, and one could live their entire life without experiencing such a perfect moment. Later, Andre wasn't sure how much later, people started pointing up at the sky and shouting. And at first Andre thought there were more fireworks until he saw not a fountain of light, but 4 tiny dots hovering in space, 2 green and 2 red. Or it wasn't quite correct to say that they were hovering, but rather vacillating between darting lateral movements and moments of stasis, which was when Andre realized that it was a drone casing the party, its tiny digital camera sending the signal to an operator located somewhere in the city. Although, given the range of contemporary drones, the operator could be almost anywhere. Sometimes the drone would dip down into the party, so close that its whirling propellers could just be made out over the bass and thump of the DJ, lingering over the swimming pool where 3 cheerleaders for the New Orleans Saints were soaking up the abnormally warm water, and who, when they spotted the drone, began splashing up at it as if it were a horsefly on a hot summer's day, searching for blood. That was when the real estate developer finally noticed the drone, and his thick, raspy voice boomed out over the party, somewhere between a roar and a laugh. "Let's get that motherfucker," he said, walking quickly back to the stairwell that led to his apartment, until, a moment later, he appeared with a rifle in his hand, which made everyone freeze in tense uncertainty, wondering what this party had suddenly become, so that all you could hear was the music and the whirring props of the drone, much louder and clearer now, until the host calmed everyone by saying, "Hey, don't worry, it's just my kid's pellet gun. Everyone chill out." And then the entire party let out a sigh of relief, at least those who knew that a pellet gun couldn't hurt anyone, maybe not even a drone. "Here, Rodrigo," the developer shouted. "Shoot that fucking drone." Sorry, Luke, we're in the children's section. It gets worse. And Rodrigo, who worked for the developer, pumped the air gun to charge it, then shot at the drone, missing. And then one of Rodrigo's friends said, "Hey man, give me that." And then he walked closer to the drone, almost underneath it, and shot. But the drone's operator, who must have seen what was happening, suddenly swerved the drone to the right, so that the friend missed too, although who could say if he would have hit, even if it had remained in place. And then the game exploded, everyone shouting for a chance at the drone, which bobbed and weaved, climbed and fell, as if taunting the drunk and beautiful people shouting and laughing and trying to shoot straight in the middle of the night. Until finally the developer shouted, "Hey, you fuckers, give me that gun." And the air gun was passed hand to hand through the crowd until the developer took it, taking aim at the drone. And for some reason, perhaps something to do with the angle that the camera was mounted on the drone, it happened to stay relatively still, slowly rising and falling like an undulating wave, until, Andre said, damned if he didn't hit it, the pellet sending the drone flipping through the air, tumbling to the ground like a winged bird, until it landed onto the concrete, its red and green lights blinking up into the sky, and the developer crowing, "Take that, motherfucker!" And then he shot it again, this time lodging the steel pellet into its circuits, so that the 4 lights, 2 green and 2 red, began to dim, everyone crowding over the dying drone, cheering and laughing into its camera, making lewd gestures and pouring champagne over its props. Those drunk, jeering faces, the last thing the drone ever saw on the first night of the year. Doing all right? All right. One more?
Yes.
The sun in El Paso, when Ed stepped off the bus, was unforgiving, like a blanket from a relentless god spread across the city. Heat waves rippled from the pavement. The streets were quiet and empty, save for the rustling of an old sandwich wrapper blown by the slightest of breezes. The cooling movement of air giving hope for some relief, but never quite fulfilling its promise. It felt as though the residents of the city were hunkered down somewhere darker and cooler, hiding from the sun's uncompromising rain. X found a bar with a large open patio covered with a fiberglass awning that provided shade for a few battered wooden tables. An old man sat at one of the tables, his beer mug beating with sweat, its moisture drawing the attention of a fly that would circle the mug, alight, and then circle again. Ignoring the fly, the man sat simply and watched the empty street. X sat down at the bar, which was empty save for the bartender, a skinny man whose long gray hair was pulled back into a ponytail. X ordered a rum and coke. "Where are you coming from?" the bartender asked as he prepared the drink. "I just got off the bus from Dallas," X replied. "But how did you know? Am I that obvious?" "Lots of folks coming and going in El Paso. Didn't you see all those trucks on the highway as you were riding into town?" "Yes," said X. "And also helicopters." "That'd be the Border Patrol. They're coming and going too. And then there's those they're trying to catch. Add in the military bases and the fact that El Paso is one of the busiest border crossings in the United States, and you can see why I figured you'd be someone passing through." X smiled. "Statistics, I guess." The bartender snorted. X couldn't tell if it was skepticism or agreement. "El Paso must be an interesting place to live with all of those people coming and going." "You could say that. Real interesting. The other night, for instance. It was a Tuesday, which is usually slow, but this was real slow, like molasses slow. Hardly anyone here. I would have boarded up early but for this fella sitting at the end of the bar, right over in that seat just there. I'd seen him in here before with some dudes I knew in the Border Patrol, so I was pretty sure he was one of them. Plus, he just felt ex-military, though lots of those guys are. Statistics, right? Big and hard from too much time in the gym, but not the pretty boy gym time like movie stars. More like a habit you pick up when you have nothing better to do but get harder and meaner. Guys who've done time can have the same feel, you know? Anyway, he come in alone that night, ordered a shot and a beer, and starts talking to me about the Rangers. Turns out he's a big baseball fan. Played in high school, where his dad was the coach, and so he knows baseball real good, way better than most folks. I mean, I like baseball, but I can't tell you the difference between a slider and a split-finger slider. This guy could. And so I let him talk, and just nodded from time to time to keep him going. Maybe I should have kicked him out, but there was something about the way he was talking that made me think there was something else going on. I've been doing this long enough that I can tell when it might be safer for a fella to get a bit sloshed and chatty at my bar than to send him back out into that night where God knows what might happen to him. So he keeps talking, and I keep pouring. He had this funny way of taking his whiskey, holding the shot glass between two fingers like it was a bird's egg he was afraid to crush. I've always said, if you look close enough, you can see big guys are trying to make themselves small somehow, and small guys try to make themselves bigger. Maybe it's human nature wanting to be something we ain't. You want another? So where was I? Right, this big border agent, talking baseball, tenderly sipping his shots of whiskey, putting off this vibe that I can't quite finger. Could be trouble. Could be nothing. This goes on all night, and around 1 in the morning I'm starting to worry that I've let him get too far gone, and that I need to start winding him down for the night. That's when things got what you might call real interesting. But then, out of nowhere, there's this kid walking up to the bar. The first thing I notice are his sneakers, because they're squeaking across the floor, like really loud. He sits down right where you are sitting now. It's dark, right? But when he sits down under the bar, I can tell that his clothes are a bit of a mess, kind of dark and grubby. But more than that, what I notice immediately is his face. He's got this pool, worn-out look of someone who's had the wind knocked out of his sails. Like he's been sick for weeks, or maybe bleeding somewhere and trying not to tell anybody. Just peaked, you know? I step over to take his order, and that's when I can smell it. That earthy, rainy smell just before a storm. And I realize that the kid's wet. Like not just dripping, but seriously soaked. And when a half-dead looking kid walks into an empty bar at 1 in the morning on a Tuesday night in El Paso, a bar not half a mile from the Rio Grande, well, that can really only mean one thing. So the kid asks me for a glass of water, real quiet. And I'm scooping ice into a glass for the kid and thinking on the one hand, kid, you're crazy for coming into a place like this looking like that. And on the other, the kid's got no money, that's obvious, but he sure as hell needs more than a glass of water. So I give him the water, which he drinks down fast, but not so fast, as if he's trying to hide how thirsty he actually is. So I fill it up again, and then give him one of these bags of chips, which is the only food we keep on hand, even though the kid hasn't asked for it. And he doesn't say nothing, just nods at me, but his eyes are all gratitude and hunger. And he opens the bag and starts eating, one chip at a time, but I could tell that if he were alone, he'd be taking them by the handful. The whole time, my border agent friend has stopped talking and is watching the kid with this kind of dopey smile on his face. But his eyes, there's something about his eyes all hard and restless. So there we are, me, this drunk lawman, and this illegal whose clothes are literally still fucking wet with the river crossing. The only sound is the kid munching on his chips. Then the cop, he lets out this kind of low sigh between his teeth. Shit, man, enough of this baseball talk. I must be boring the hell out of you. I like baseball, I tell him. You're fine, partner. It's been a hell of a day, he says. Tell you what, let me get one more beer. And give one to that guy over there. Can I buy you a beer, friend? He shouts over to the kid, louder than he has to. The kid stops his chewing, glances over at the cop with his eyes, and takes a sip of water to clear his throat. He nods once. Thank you, sir. You look like you could use a beer with those chips, he says. So I pour the beers, and I'm sweating steel bullets at this point, because I can't tell what the border agent is thinking, and maybe the kid is walking into a trap, which of course is his own damn fault, not to mention his shit luck. But I also know that my border agent friend is 3 sheets to the wind, that he's probably packing, and that even if he isn't, he's the kind of guy who could split this kid over his knee without breaking a sweat. The agent lifts his beer in the air toward the kid, who does the same. Cheers, buddy, the agent says, taking a pull. Cheers, the kid says. Yes, sir, the agent says. One hell of a day. You want to know why? He asks me. But I can tell he's watching the kid, too. Or maybe he's not talking to either of us. Just talking, to the air maybe, or someone who only he can see. But I'm guessing we've gotten near to the end of the line with this kid's English, so I try to keep the agent talking. Why, I ask. Well, I'll tell you. We had to go out in the desert today and pack up some bodies. I don't usually get called out for that kind of shit. They keep me busy driving up and down Highway 10, working the checkpoints and nabbing illegals trying to hitchhike. So then he tells us about how they sometimes find these bodies in the desert, and it's buzzards that tip them off. The buzzards start circling and piling up in the air, like a dust devil lighting up the desert floor. Most times it's just a dead deer or maybe a runaway cow, but sometimes it's bodies, so they always check it out. But for some reason they tapped this border agent for the job, so he and his partner are out there in their 4x4 pickup, running right up next to the border. And that's when they find him, curled up underneath a scrub brush like they were hoping it would keep him safe. At first he thinks it's just a single body, but as they pull up and the buzzards scatter, some flying, some hopping a few feet away and then staring at them with their bald heads and flat eyes, the agent and his partner realize that it's actually a woman and a child, no more than a year old. And she's lying on her side up underneath that bush with her back to the desert and the baby's tucked up in her arms. So yeah, pretty fucked up, he says, finishing his beer. As we were driving back, these bodies wrapped in plastic in the bed of the truck, I keep thinking, what the hell makes somebody walk with a baby from Guatemala or El Salvador or wherever the fuck you're from, all the way across Mexico, when you know at the other side you're probably going to get caught anyway and sent to some prison or some tent camp in the desert? Must be something pretty bad, right? Then he stops talking. We're sitting there in the silence. And just as I'm wondering how much of the story the kid has understood, he pipes up. That's a bad story, he says. Yeah, a bad story, the agent says. Well, he goes, I'm finished. Good night, boys. So he tosses a $100 bill on the bar, which is way too much, and stands up. But then as he tries to walk to the street, he just falls. Bam! Crumples like someone hit him with a ton of bricks. I'm thinking, fuck me. And then I hear him mumbling from down the floor. I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay. And the kid is looking a little edgy at this point. And all I care about is getting this guy out the door. But as he's lying there, he's looking even bigger than I realized. So I yell over to the kid, hey, help me pick him up. The kid hops off the stool and gets down with me. We each grab an arm and pull the border agent up to his feet, walk him out to the patio, and set him down on one of the benches there. Can you sit with him while I call a cab? I ask the kid. And the kid nods and sits down next to the agent, who's starting to slump forward, so that the kid has to wrap his arms around the cop and hold him up to keep him from falling on his face. And the cop's head just kind of lolls over onto the kid's shoulder. 15 minutes later, the cab shows up, and we shuffle the agent into the back seat, and off he goes. Thanks, I say to the kid. He nods. Thanks for the food, he says. Sure, I say. Good luck. And he walks off into the night, disappearing into the dark, with those squeak, squeak, squeaking shoes. Yep, the bartender smiled. That's what I mean when I say you're either coming or going in El Paso. Thanks.
Ooh. That was amazing. I have to say that what really struck me when I read it, and struck me even more hearing your beautiful voice reading it, was the blend of detail and plot.
Oh, thank you.
Because it's riveting, but it's also, there's so much to think about. There's so much portrayed. Anyway, thank you. Okay, let me reorganize my brain now. That was amazing.
Thanks so much.
Really,
Yeah.
I'm really happy I got to read it. It's always interesting when you read a book and then you hear the author read, and you know, because their voice has a certain rhythm and a certain tone, so it was like a, you know, opening to present or something. I mean, reading it was a present too. So I'm going to read a very short piece that's been appearing in a publication Paula mentioned called Threefold. And for those of you who don't know, it's a wonderful art politic journal edited by Rebecca Mazzei. And the 9th issue has just come out, and it's free. And it's international, so, you know, there's a lot of Detroiters and then other people too. So I would, if I were you and interested in this, I would highly recommend checking out threefold.org. And Rebecca Mazzei is the proprietor of Trina Soap, if any of you are familiar with that. So I have a series that's been published in 8 of the issues, and I'm not going to go into the whole architecture of it, but I'm going to read a short piece of the fiction. And it begins with, if I have it, yes. It begins with our narrator, and her dear friend Rose, who live in a beautiful town. And Rose is the head librarian in this town, which faces the sea. This morning, after trapeze practice, Rose and I sit on the library steps, rehydrating with lemon water, while taking in trees, sky, ducks, dogs, grass, birds, and squirrels, as well as children on scooters, walking, running, and biking towards school, and teachers, administrators, desk and building staff heading there too, carrying briefcases, duffels, or backpacks, other adults making their way to offices or the train station, walking pets, wading into the ocean, venturing into the forest or hills, or with climbing gear up into the mountain. Robert, our town's visiting aquatic researcher, approaches in his wetsuit. "We found something on the ocean floor," he says, removing the bandana from his neck and squatting down to wipe up water droplets forming at his feet. Rose stands, enters the library, and returns, carrying fresh cloths from the pile stacked behind the checkout desk. Robert accepts one, dabs the remaining moisture, and repeats, "We found something on the ocean floor." Rose feigns disinterest. She is never, from what I know, disinterested. Excuse me, I have my lucky runny nose handkerchief here, which I always get when I read. Always. Sorry. For our head librarian Rose, whose eyes track any landscape like a high-end security camera, announced Tom, our town mayor, at the recent annual fest, when presenting her once again with the Genuine Citizen Award. "We're lucky to have Rose," he continued. "Sometimes I wonder if she might, now and then, turn her attention upward, take in astral knowledge, and be nourished, even exhilarated, while, frankly, giving us Earth life forms some privacy." He and all of us in the small crowd smiled, chuckled, and clapped. He was right that Rose absorbs and scrutinizes surroundings, including us, her friends, colleagues, and neighbors. Whoops. I think I just lost it. Let's see. Yep, it's not, oh, okay, wait a minute, no, I've got it. I understand the scrutiny, though, is for study. It's a training exercise in the way our trapeze work and reading are. Ways for her to, as she says, stay supple. But our mayor's point about possibilities between Rose and stars is solid. I worry about her lack of self-care, and am touched that he does too. Astral attentiveness might activate different, needier personal spots that she neglects. Now, looking up at the sky, I am hit with a familiar unsettling jolt that comes with the possibility it will someday be my forever home. Sometimes this makes me scared. Others, I wonder how much longer I have to wait. And others, I crave self-harm to a point when I cannot read, be consciously careful during trapeze practice, find myself leaning too far over Carl's boat if his back is turned when we sail through shark-infested waters, or when at the station I count down to when I think the right moment might be to dive in front of a train. Sorry. After Tom's speech that day, there were hors d'oeuvres, a platter with a small bowl of sweet butter, surrounded by circles of bread, and oblong trays of cheese, salami, pickles, halved radishes, and jams fanning out. Robert, agitated, pulled me aside and whispered, "You'd think they'd have olive oil." We lost someone I loved very much to butter that was bacteria infested. I no longer consume it, but olive oil is a safe replacement and healthier. Did you know it has internal cleansing properties? I put my hand on his shoulder. he looked down at the ground and said, "We must try harder. Humans in general must all just try harder." This morning, after drying himself off, he looks up, snaps his fingers, and says to Rose and me, "Don't let me forget why I came to see you." Reaching into the bellows pocket attached to his wetsuit, he pulls out a clear evidence bag containing a limp, misshapen object. "We found this on the ocean floor. I'm fairly certain it is my mother's glove." We stand in silence. After a moment, he continues, "It is waterlogged, but otherwise in good condition. No rips or decay. Each finger slot is whole and in place. Ocean floors in general these days, as you know, are strewn with rags, sewage, chemicals, broken machinery, and toys. I found no evidence of any of that on yours. In fact, it's pristine. So what might this lone glove of my mother signal?" Rose crosses her arms and looks down at the grass and up at the sky. Robert does the same. After a while, he looks straight ahead, briefly taps his chest, and says, "Your reserve speaks volumes. This event provides evidence, but not enough for any kind of answer. There's always more gathering to do. But you know what's more important? We must consider ways to process and implement our findings." So that's the piece. If you like it, you can check out Oulipo. So I'm going to read from this book, which came out the day of lockdown, and I'll never forget the cardboard boxes on our porch that we just let sit there for a few days. So I haven't read from many parts of it, but this is an ekphrastic detective novel, and what I mean by that is Paula Regossy is the top agent in a detective agency, and it's run by a mysterious but benevolent figure named Hoss. And each chapter is an agent in the agency narrating their story. And ekphrastic is because each chapter is my response to some visual artwork that I experienced in the Detroit area. And you don't really need to know that, but that's how I got a lot of surprise and inspiration. So I have not read this part. It's Lines of Duty 1 and 2. And in Lines of Duty 1, a teenager named Elizabeth finds a murdered body in their neighborhood, a beloved woman named June. And Lines of Duty 2 is her father, who is an agent, and his name is Bruno. Lines of Duty, Agent Bruno. My daughter Elizabeth, a fine detective, puts herself in training from the start. When I have to just say how she caught the killer of June was she came up with a profile. The sky at sunset looked like a carnivorous flower. And that line is from Roberto Bolaño. So she profiled the killer with a book sentence. I hoped our daughter would move on from tracking murder to some form of bureaucratic forensics because I hated thinking of her dealing with all that savagery. "They fuck you up, your mom and dad," said some Brit. Now, frustratingly, here I am a dad, doing just that. But catch myself doing it and say, "Bruno, stop. It's you, not your daughter, who cringes at violence. Don't conflate." The blurred boundaries between my daughter and I might come from having a child later in life. Later in life as a considered decision, not a careless act of intimacy. Later in life, when you're employed, partnered, and a homeowner. When you're dedicated to raising your desired child right, therefore must dismantle and restructure established patterns and boundaries around things that served and still serve you. Things like working, thinking, jogging, hanging out, having sex. The adjustment's a drag, but you get used to it. In fact, you come to love it. You soon find your best life with this child who you love and who loves you. There's so much to live and be thankful for. Then She reaches an age when she does not need or want your brand of steady care. In fact, she finds it and you annoying. Questions and comments that used to be answered with a yeah, okay, or a hand clap. More toast? Wear a sweater. Want to play catch? Now get it no, or an eye roll. My wife, Elizabeth's mother, Hannah, unsurprisingly has no problem with the transition or with transitions in general. She adopts a role, then shifts to another, all the while staying herself. Yes, my wife is an actress, but more importantly, owns a solid center and is able to reallocate offshoots of routines and affection without diminishment. Think of a long-standing tree. Hannah is its multiple blossoming branches. I'm the trunk, inching slowly in one simple vertical direction. It's just me who has problems with change in our family. And as our daughter matures, I get personal time and privacy back, but struggle to make them great again. So I soul search. And over time, with Agent Paula Regossy's help, I discover how to update myself and my father-daughter bond at once. Detective work. I do not track or even help track individual killers because the immediacy of violence is too brutal for me personally. I fall for tragic scenarios around murders and missing persons. I imagine, to the point where I partially feel, the anguish of the target and their loved ones. I graphically picture the victim days, hours, and moments leading up to the attack. I see the lifeless body the instant after. I envision kidnapped people quivering, bound, drugged, starved, routinely assaulted. The friends and family grappling with the disappearance, wondering if the absent one has done a runner, collapsed from an illness, maybe eloped, or is planning a surprise. Then as time drags on and such possibilities seem uncertain, I can imagine these friends and family members sitting or pacing inside public halls, private living rooms, stunned, sickened, terrified, or outdoors, recklessly stomping, searching, hoping to help, or at least have something to do. My internal narratives around these scenes are pictorial, detailed, and invasive. But our daughter Elizabeth, in contrast, compartmentalizes. She takes on grisly case elements with a determination to solve. She dissects and analyzes motive, strategy, background, and their intersection. Her profiles help officers identify and apprehend elusive nasties, the methodic carnival worker, the petulant industrialist, the cocky college student, the bored entrepreneur convinced they're underappreciated. Not my lane. My daughter and I work in crime, but have different job sets. She focuses on individuals, while I fixate on structures. My colleagues and I address small pieces of this wreckage when we can by employing process and technology to investigate misdoings of fake legitimates, meaning legal government and corporate systems built on narrowly specific values turned into rules, manuals, and laws. In other words, bogus truths. Our target is not a discrete human, but an apparatus, broad, deep, multi-tentacled. Our marks are wealthy companies that wreak wide-scale damage yet contribute. For example, authorize toxic dumps in waterways and launch and fund charitable and arts foundations. Evade taxes, employ people, and provide them with insurance, resumes, securities, and upward mobility. Think of Elizabeth's approach as a spear. Ours is seepage. In June's case, they intersect. The murderer Elizabeth profiles and helps apprehend is embedded within and protected by a vast entity and its well-padded, protective branches. We have a book in our library at home that has Banality of Evil in its title. The 3 words profile a large portion of my criminal targets. Legal organizations that task workers to authorize damaging procedures with a click or a signature without making clear where that leads. For example, the staff is assigned daily tasks, signing a form, sending an invoice, that can and does land them in positions of inflicting harm without intending to, okaying the previously mentioned dumped waste, and other things like a signature that, not obviously, okays animal overcrowding in food factories and diminishes pension plans, or an order to employ staff from a national roster, not the communities the companies are based in, or a form that mandates staff below a certain wage level park far off-site and must shuttle to the office. Workers executing a discrete duty rather than an intentional cruelty. It's not a murder, but a compliance with job duties. Now, this is how I understand and am helped professionally by the term banality of evil. Harm done within a social and legal contract, not slitting a throat, bombing a bank, or breaking the leg of a racehorse. Now, I've never read that book, or even removed it from our shelf. My take on its partial title may or may not be faithful to the author's intent, but it sure serves me personally and professionally, so I stick with it. I could say bureaucracies are the real evil, not killers, but the fact is they're both bad. I stick with systems. That's my skill set. You might see me working, hunched over my desk, tapping at surface, rubbing my scalp and chin, missing cigarettes. I love my job, but might not appear to. I thrive on worry and anxiety. My cases bring both, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I sit as long as possible because breaks interrupt my thought train. For maximum productivity, I need to be patient and never expect consistent momentum. Like my favorite off-duty activity, fishing, I don't do it for consistent results. Some days I catch fish, others I don't. I am happy to provide these work details and any documentation of my success and failures, but unhappy with visual documentation of me working, especially by a stranger, because how I look is not representative of who I am, how I think, or what I do. When I work, I look miserable, but feel electric. In contrast, Elizabeth appears serene, but tells me she does not feel that way. She sits in an erect half lotus and pores over notes, files, and documents between moments of stillness, eyes closed, or maybe staring into space. Yet she tells me she feels anxiety. She hides it while working, and when it creeps in, she has outlets. Job stress fuels Elizabeth to move away from one spot to others, to books, our piano, yards, people. She walks our dog Boots, converses with our neighbor Zeb, and returns to a case sharing something Zeb said, like honeybees like white clover, but not red clover, because their tongues are too short to reach the red clover nectar. Her composure's regained. But when I hear Zeb say things like that, I ruminate on it all day. So wait until evening or weekends to spend time with Zeb. He diverts me from work. But for Elizabeth, it's not a diversion, just a switch opening a door to a case breakthrough. Breaks, she says, clear my thinking. They help soften the enormity of it all. Why do the powerful and privileged usually feel the most beleaguered? I don't know. But I do know that they do. And June's killer is an example. Influential, infatuated with multiple intense, short-lived interests, convinced of his long personal sufferance. I debated disclosing his name here, but a mission as unusual and will draw attention. Standing out in any way is the first thing he wants and the last he needs, so I have no problem stating his name. George. Think of all the good Georges. Carlin, Clinton, Gershwin, and the great British detective, Gently. June's killer George will never ruin the name. So from here on, George, if hate's a thing, I feel it for you. But I do not want to let myself stoop that low. So when I sense the sentiment seeping in, I breathe deeply and mentally repeat, be the change, Bruno. George, the CEO ruining our municipal river by ordering executives to task staff with signing forms that allow it to be filled with poisonous chemicals. June, an environmental lawyer, makes a case to halt this and, because it does not happen, close the factory. The company counters with an airtight legal defense, but June finds a loophole. Her win, their loss, took George to a new place. Until then, I did not fully understand the precision of our daughter Elizabeth's profile from that Bolano book. The sky at sunset looked like a carnivorous flower. But once I saw George interviewed, I understood completely. That's not just his profile, but his plan. He murdered June at sunset, and in his mind, transitioned her to the sky. Elizabeth and I watch footage of our investigator interviewing George. George presents himself like the educated contemporary he is, tall, limber, white shirt and teeth, colorful embroidered wristbands, Bermudas, we first met in summer, tanned shins. He quotes the same Nietzsche line twice. The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. In his office, he has pictures of himself doing arm balances in busy markets and in front of a temple in Mumbai, because he likes to travel, because he believes India is his home, because there he got off prescribed pharmaceuticals, because India feeds his soul and reminds him to meditate, pray, and eat vegetarian. It reminds him he is privileged and must give back. After the self-disclosure, he explains that June was wrong to shut his company down. Excuse me. His dumping was legal. He owns the land and the building and is allowed access to adjacent water. He gives back. His chicken feeds families. June's actions were wrong, but she was giving him a flirt. His face softens. His eyes grow misty, and he gives a small smile as he veers into a story about June, about the first time he saw her, about how in her he met his match, a match for another, not this dimension, how they can and will coexist in the sky, how she orchestrated her murder, and to expedite it, she only pretended to go against him. This fake descent made it impossible for them to be together in this here now, but opened the door for their multi-spheric future. He went on how they were both at a point where they needed someone or thing to tell them what to do. June asked for her murder, only an end to one face, paving the way to another, where they will hold hands, leap over oceans, islands, and continents. June's death here in this dimension will only be the first step toward their infinite union in others. And the plan gave him something bigger than this time and place to think about. Another life, one of beauty, meaning, embellishment. He details how he searched long and hard for that substantial brooch to fasten the note he found, to her silk skirt. He bought it at an antique shop in Italy. He details how he thought so deeply about what note to write, choosing the word from Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, but you don't really care for music, do you? And he spent long hours trying to picture the Gothic font he wanted to pen it. And for that period, he expressed himself in a way that was truly and distinctly him. No one could do what he did the way he did it. That image of June dead, radiating beauty, eliciting pity. His murder was his love letter. It will take him and June to a new place. They share a love for music. They'll soon be somewhere with music, and islands, and trees, and they'll be able to fly. He said how meeting June, her beating him, then him beating her, opened the door for them to be together in solidarity. Listening to this puts us in a sickening position. We have to let George talk. This kind of speech, though, feeds something terrible, a bleak vanity. It does not get us closer at some point to what we need. In fact, it starts distancing us from our goal. We need to solve this case. June was our friend, our neighbor, and hearing this use of words, evil, from the mouth of a criminal who's self-congratulating means we must shut him down. He's padding. We need an intervention, and Elizabeth did it. I found June. Let me take this, our daughter said. Then stood, entered the room, sat next to the interviewer across from George, asked him to repeat his story. He, visibly pleased to have a new audience, talked at length, settling more and more deeply into his chair. Elizabeth did not need to continue questioning. Our interviewer covered that. Elizabeth needed to disrupt. At some point, she opened her folder, took out a piece of paper with a pre-prepared, neatly typed sentence, handed it to him and said, "George, can you read this to me?" He took the paper and read, "The truth and the whole truth are not the same thing." He looked at Elizabeth. She asked him to read it again and again. He did, and grew increasingly derailed because of the power shift, because the words prevented him from using his own. They cornered him into speaking responsibly. Agent Paula Regossy taught us that with perpetrators like him, you appeal to their vanity, then pull that advantage away. George began to nod while reciting the line, sensing his vanity was being rewarded with power, but then he slowed down and stopped talking. His eyes settled into a blank pool. He appeared emotionless, like a primordial shark or serpent. Those words outwitted him, therefore shut him down. Nothing stops people who believe they are truly intelligent more than something that is. The truth and the whole truth are not the same thing. Elizabeth leaned toward George. "Don't misunderstand me, George. We don't doubt your connection to everything you've told us. But you're wrong. You have a clipped version, but we have a bigger, more comprehensive version, one that, along with other data, proves your truth and the whole truth are not the same thing, and you, George, are heading to jail, not the sky." This was the first but not last case my daughter and I worked on together. Elizabeth's profile identified George. Her apprehension strategy caught him. My team's forensics gathered necessary prosecuting data and closed the factory and sent George away. My daughter and I are dedicated professionals with, as Agent Paula Regossy helped us see, complementary but different skill sets. This case, June's, is our first but not last. We don't always team up, but when we do, it sure is a privilege and effective. Thank you.